Hi, Rashid Kapadia here with a description of my talk, an overview of happiness. Now, let me start by saying right away, this is not a how to find happiness or secrets of happiness or 3 steps to happiness or anything along those lines. No, this is more a context, an overview from a historian's perspective, from a scientist's perspective. Where do we stand with our knowledge of happiness? I mean, historians ask questions, very valid questions. Are you, am I, or for that matter, a billionaire in Wall Street? Are we any more happy than one of our ancestors who lived 500 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago? Fact is, we don't really know, we don't have any way of knowing. And yet, we have made some extraordinary progress from the last 50,000 years, 10,000 years, 500 years, even the last 50 years, mind-boggling progress. And yet, if we don't even know whether we are happier as a result of all this, then this is a big lacuna, it's a big void, it's a big unanswered question in history. So obviously scientists and historians try to study it. What do they do? Let me tell you how I came about this topic. Excellent book by Yuval Noah Harari called Sapiens, and one of his chapters, he's a historian, one of his chapters is called And They Lived Happily Ever After. So the foundation is taken from that chapter, and it's a report on what is the state of happiness, so to speak. And he said, what do scientists do? They have surveys, studies, and they try to make some sense of the data, and social scientists reach one bunch of conclusions, and biologists reach another bunch, and we'll discuss all of that. Social scientists, for example, say. Now, you and I, if I ask you what makes you happy, we'd obviously say health and wealth. But the social scientists say that beyond a certain baseline, we can't seem to prove this. Below a baseline, yes, you will be unhappy. But after a certain quite a low baseline, it doesn't appear, or at least the data doesn't show us that health and wealth makes us happy. But what the data does show us that those of us who are more committed and have excellent relationships, we care about community, about service, about marriage, about family, we seem to have a higher correlation with happiness. And then yet another twist, you might say, is it really the objective factors? What about subjective expectations and experiences? And they said, no, the objective factors don't matter independently. It also depends on our subjective experiences. How do we make sense of all of this? Another question that we don't have very good answers for. Biologists reach a completely different conclusion. They look at the data and say, it really depends very little on the external conditions, or on which period of history you lived in, or which tribe, or any place you were born. It comes down to your biology. Neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, dopamine, stress chemicals, some kind of surplus of happiness chemicals over stress chemicals really is what decides how happy you're going to be in life. And everyone has a range, and your destiny of happiness is to live within that range. That's how biologists view it. So it just comes down to how we feel inside of ourselves. No. It does appear there's another question. What about the meaning of life? What about some of us who find long-term happiness, a sense of purpose, meaning, even though we live with some drudgery and less pleasant sensations? How do we fit this into our understanding of happiness? Surely we all crave for meaning. There isn't anyone who doesn't want to have significance. Yet what is significance? Is it just a mental construct? Is it something more? These are the questions they're looking at. Finally, know yourself. The more you know yourself and the more you're able to accept yourself, and you're able to tune your responses at the basis of this. This is another basis of studying happiness. And they also take a look at Buddhism, which we think of as a religion, but you might pragmatically see it as the same effort, a scientific inquiry, a process. What causes happiness 2,500 years ago is the question they asked. Though the question they really asked is, what actually alleviates suffering? And the Buddhist approach seems to tie up with the biologist approach quite well. That it comes down to things that are happening in our body. But the Buddhists take a very different approach then. They say whatever happens in our body is sort of temporary. And it's not what happens, but it's how we respond to what happens. For instance, if we have a pleasant feeling, then we crave more of it. And if we have an unpleasant feeling, then we have an aversion to it. And they argue, the Buddhists, that suffering is a result of both craving and aversion. And a life that is minimizing suffering is one where you neither react or suppress any of these, but you skillfully, with a calm mind, you observe what's happening. That is the way to alleviate suffering. It covers a lot of context. And it certainly helped bring some clarity. I was so glad I read this chapter. It's marvelous. It just is. I converted it into a speech because I feel this is important. I like an analytical, clear thinking approach. And I believe this is a useful talk in the times we live in, as we chase prizes without really knowing if we are becoming happy or not. So this is a description of one of my talks, an overview of happiness. I'd love to discuss it further with you, to be able to perhaps someday present to one of your audiences, and I assure you, I will do all I can to make you and your audiences happy with the result.